My talk is actually was inspired when Ben asked me to talk here. The whole notion of increasing resilience, and the notion is, as we have increasing change happening, are we building the mechanisms to be resilient to cope with the change? So a little bit of background. My first career was in the design of hospital information systems and electronic medical record systems, and I retired about 10 years ago to apply my talents to, or energies to humanitarian and philanthropic activities. So that's where I did a Stanford Digital Visions program. I have a group called the Uplift Academy now that's kind of a think tank. It's run out of my home. I have a lot of workshops, and very similar to the Humanity Plus concept of what can we use to make the world a better place. But one of the turning points in my healthcare career was that I realized that anything I did to make the healthcare system more efficient, given the current state of the perversities of the incentives in healthcare, if I made the healthcare system more efficient, I'd just make it get worse faster. And it was kind of a sobering experience to see what technology would end up doing. I went into a philanthropic world and saw very similar dynamics happening in international development, and basically this dependency relationship of the assistance making you more dependent. So came up with this term, I call it the problem industrial complex. And we have these problems and we want to solve them, so we have an industry to create the solution to it. The industry is motivated to make the problem go away. The metric then is how bad is the problem. So, you get into this downward spiral, and there's this thing called the Copenhagen Consensus a couple years ago. If you had $15 billion, what would you spend it on? I call it a beauty contest for problems. So everybody parade their problem in front, say, well, education is worse. No, it's AIDS. No, it's women's empowerment. So my problem is worse than your problem. Well, what about if education, AIDS, women's empowerment, and entrepreneurship were all actually one of the same solution? You'd never see it by looking at the problems. By the way, I've given up on my PowerPoint slides. I've already succumbed to death by PowerPoint this weekend. So I'm going to use chalk, okay? And I haven't used chalk for 30 years, I don't think, but just the idea that I'm writing on the same chalkboard that Richard Feynman was probably writing on, and I just can't get away from it. So, one of the things I came up with the Uplift Academy, and this relates to the previous speaker about working from joy instead of deficit. Martin Seligman in popular positive psychology is big on this. He came out from a background in psychology of learned helplessness and teaching rats to be helpless in a cage. He said, well, can you teach them to be optimistic? Turns out, yes, you can. And then the whole idea of taking this, what I call a positive flip from fixing the problem to the making the good stuff better. So he came up with a balancing act to what's called the DSM 3, 4, 5 or whatever, Diagnostic Standards Manual for Disease. But basically it's this manual psychiatrists use to, the 100,000 ways to be sick. But there's no valuation of what's positive, what makes people happy and healthy. So he created a thing called Character Strengths and Virtues, which is basically this manual of what it means to be positive. So that was positive psychology. David Cooperrider at Case Western uses a thing called Appreciative Inquiry, which is instead of saying, what's your problems, how do we fix it, what are your strengths and how do we do more of it? So rather than focus on the problems and working your way down through the problem resolution and the problem industrial complex, you have this positive look. So if you kind of take a thing of -10 is collapse, 0 is sustainability, and +10 is flourishing on this continuum here. Here's a really bad problem, and if we're really lucky, we can get it up to 0 and it's not a problem anymore, so we can achieve sustainability. But to get to flourishing is an entirely different issue than to resolve the specific problem. So if you cast your worldview as this dialectic of the negative and the positive being this contraposed thing, like the narrative we talked about yesterday in the television series, you can't get away from the problem orientation. So if this is war and this is peace, and this is neutral, the question becomes, well, how much war can we avoid? Well, how many peacekeepers can we afford? And if we're really lucky, we'll come up to here. So if you define peace as the absence of war, you turn yourself into a military-industrial complex saying, how do we fight war to keep it out of there? But if you look at peace as, you know, the joy, the walking on the beach at the sunset with your lover or whatever, it's an entirely different plus 10 from being, you know, okay, satisfied, you're home watching the TV or something, you're somewhat at peace, but the question is, can you go from a little bit to a whole lot of the good? So basically, negating the negative to get here is different than promoting the positive. So this sense of resilience that we've been talking about in my Uplift Academy workshops is looking at this area here of the positive. How do you get to the flourishing world? Sustainability isn't really enough. And I also wanted to give credit to David Brin. David's a neighbor and friend of mine, and he's a very frustrating person to be around because every time I have an idea, I bring it to him, and he says, well, I wrote a book about that already. But so he talks about resilience in the post 9/11 world, and all of the hierarchical control structures that happened on 9/11 failed. The military, the police, the fire department. The only thing that worked was the citizen response. So the citizen, the active citizenry, was the resilience on 9/11. It wasn't the military who, you know, how can you allow a plane to fly into your Pentagon and blame little old ladies in wheelchairs as the, well, I don't want to get into that topic. The point is, resilience is a really key topic. We've touched on it in a lot of the talks here on how you build this. One of the models I like to use to explain is, I call it toasters, cats, and snowflakes. And a toaster is a gadget. If you lose the cord, you put a new one on, you have the toaster back in shape. You fix what's wrong with the toaster, you have a whole toaster again. A cat, however, you fix what's wrong with a broken tail on a cat, you try to put a tail back on the cat, you're not going to necessarily fix it. And the whole cat isn't equal to the dissected cat. You can't dissect a cat and put it back together again. So the whole of the cat is more than the sum of the cat. So we have these toaster-like metrics and understandings, but we have these cat-like problems in society. So the basic tension that I see is we have toaster-like thinking to solve cat-like problems, and this discordant thing between the linear and the nonlinear thinking. And one of the dynamics that I've seen, I was active with, my company took Network Solutions public, which did the domain name resolution company business. But if you're looking at the complexity of a network and you're putting two people together on an intercom, it's two intercoms and one wire. 3 intercoms is 3, 4 intercoms is 6, and it goes up quite a bit. So you end up, if this is your cost of your network, and this is the size of the network, it starts out pretty cheap, you know, just one wire, but it goes up rather quickly. If you put in a PBX, a central exchange, it costs more money, but the marginal cost per phone is fairly low, so it kind of looks like this. Well, if you're looking at your network and your growth of your system, the intercom looks like a pretty good solution initially, but as you grow, the costs go up, and you come up with this cost, but you think that you should have, you realize that if you'd spent this initial cost, you could be here now. So what happens is you start working your way up this curve, and the sunk costs of having invested in the intercom are so great that you don't want to do this. So this is what I call the adaptive stress of the system. So you're trying to put more wires and more buttons and make the intercom work in your organization, realizing that it would have been better to come up with a cleaner alternative, but the cost of that is just too much to go back and unhook all of your wires and everything else. So this is what I call the integration crunch mode, that you've got this network, you're trying to pull it together, and it's very brittle. your sunk costs are so great that you can't escape from it. So in this worldview, I'll call this the point solution. I'll call this the integrated solution. And what happened in the internet was the domain name system and the web came along, and we have a whole new dynamic, which was, I'll call the associative system, which was the web domain names. And you get a domain name and you can go forever. So the cost here, everybody suddenly, instead of having a proprietary network in their organization, would give it up and come back down here. So this is the associative system. It's based on names and linkage. The network effect takes over. And this avalanche, I call it, the associative avalanche, happens when the cost of the integration crunch becomes so great and there's a lower cost alternative out there that the system just cascades. And that's what happened with the .com world and the network effect. And Network Solution was the company that had the domain name registry, and we ended up buying a company for 11 million or 10 million and selling it for 3 billion. So that was a pretty neat thing. I call it the ticket taker at the avalanche. I'm not a fan of Network Solutions, and don't blame me for it. But anyway, but this associative avalanche, I think, is a key. You could think of this as a singularity type effect, that the cost of crunching all this together and trying to make it fit together. Have I already had the 5 hit me? Yes. Okay. And so that cost comes up there. And the dislocation of all these inefficiencies that is stuck here in the integration crunch just cascades, and suddenly everybody's doing this new thing. So Groupon, the $6 billion Google acquisition that didn't happen, that's an example of this associative avalanche. And I think that if we're looking towards designing systems for the future, being able to build these loosely coupled associative systems rather than trying to build tightly coupled integrated systems is the way to go. So the characteristics of this space is that it's name-oriented, it's vision-oriented. There needs to be a vision of what it would be like to have this associative space, and rather than focus on all the costs of fixing the historical sunk costs of the intercom system, look at the neat thing you can do here. So rather than your intercom saying, well, we have these neat buttons, say, well, here you can fax China because you're connected to the larger system. So this dynamic here is part of this resilient thing. You could call this a network of abundance. You could call it an autocatalytic space. An autocatalytic space has the property that when you put stuff in it, it gets bigger. Entropic space, you put a Starbucks in a shopping center, you can't use it for a Barnes & Noble. The web is an autocatalytic space. You put a Amazon.com on it, and you still have room for eBay. In fact, it enhances each other. So if you build things as an autocatalytic space, you don't build the scarcity dynamics and the entropic dynamics into it, away you go. This is a very profound subject. It gets into thermodynamics and gets into all kinds of interesting things. I only have 1 more minute, but what I want to do is draw a wormhole for Richard Feynman. And so this is the wormhole. And the reason that we don't have more time travel is we just don't have the mouths of the wormhole, okay? So everybody, this is your wormhole. You can put anything you want in there, and I'll just leave it here and the people on the video. If you happen to have any insights after the meeting here that you attribute to the wormhole, let me know. I built a wormhole in Second Life 5 years ago, and still I'm getting wild ideas. So what I'm going to put in the wormhole for Richard Feynman and Paul Dirac and everything, the biggest bang for buck, if I could send a message back 100 years to the scientists who were doing these things, and it was really expensive to send it, I'd send a single message here. So this is a message, and it's a minus sign, and it's the minus t in Maxwell's equation that people are ignoring. The people are not looking at time going backwards. They're assuming that causality is the law, that only effects precede causes. You can't have a cause precede its, or you can't have an effect precede its cause, because that would be crazy. It would violate causality. That's baloney. I think we need to look at negative T solutions to Maxwell's equations. So that's my wish for Richard Feynman and them. So thank you.
We have